The first time Karen stood in front of me with her clipboard, her short bobbed hair bouncing like it had its own temper, I thought she was joking. "Elevator usage fee," she said, in that clipped, rehearsed tone she always used when she was trying to sound official. "Each time you use the elevator, it's $2. Residents must comply with HOA policy." I laughed. Not because it was funny. No, there was nothing remotely humorous about it. But because sometimes laughter is the only thing left when you're staring at insanity wrapped in a smug smile. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-anointed queen of our condominium complex, a woman whose veins ran thick with HOA bylaws and whose heart beat in rhythm with the sound of complaint forms. "Karen," I said, doing my best to hold back the frustration already simmering inside me, "I bought this condo. That elevator came with the building. You don't own it." Her lips pressed together, her nose flared, and her eyes locked onto me like she was a prison warden and I was an inmate caught with contraband. "Actually," she hissed, "the elevator is a shared amenity. The board has voted. If you use it, you pay. It's fair. Wear and tear costs money." She wasn't joking. She was dead serious. And standing there in the lobby, with residents coming and going, I saw the shame in their faces, because they were all paying it. They had already caved, already handed over their $2 here, $5 there, like sheep feeding the wolf so they wouldn't be bitten. But I wasn't a sheep. That night, I sat on my balcony, staring at the dim glow of the courtyard lights, listening to the creak of the cables that ran right through the shaft beside my unit. The sound had always been background noise. Tonight, it felt like a taunt. I thought of my neighbors, the elderly couple on the fourth floor who could barely walk, the single mom with 2 toddlers who had to juggle strollers and grocery bags. How could anyone look them in the eye and demand money for using a lift in their own home? Karen could. She thrived on control, her life an endless hunger for petty victories. And now she wanted to turn the elevator into her personal coin machine. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I wasn't the type to bend. She thought she had me cornered, like she had everyone else. She was wrong. The war didn't start with a bang. It started with me standing in the elevator the next morning, pressing the button to the lobby with my coffee in hand. Karen stepped in behind me, her perfume cloying, her expression smug. "You'll need to log your ride," she said, holding out her clipboard like a cop giving a ticket. $2, please." I sipped my coffee and looked at her. Not a chance. Her face froze, then twitched. She wasn't used to defiance. "That's against policy," I replied, stepping out as the doors slid open. My voice echoed through the lobby, and I knew the residents watching felt something stir inside them, a crack in the fear. Karen followed me like a shadow, muttering about fines, penalties, hearings. I didn't look back, but I knew this was only the beginning. For weeks, the battle escalated. Notices slipped under my door. Failure to comply will result in fines. Letters posted on the HOA board. Residents must pay for elevator usage or face suspension of privileges. Privileges. As if being able to reach the 10th floor without collapsing from exhaustion was some luxury they were bestowing upon us. The board meetings grew heated. I showed up every time and challenged her. She'd read out her nonsense proposals in that voice dripping with self-importance, and I'd dismantle them word by word in front of everyone. The crowd was divided, half of them too scared to resist, the other half quietly cheering me on but unwilling to speak up. Then came the day she tried to cut me off. I stepped into the elevator with my arms full of groceries. Karen appeared, almost as if she'd been waiting. She slipped inside, pressed the emergency stop button, and glared at me. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "But you're just one man. You can't win against the board." I leaned against the wall, calm, letting her anger bounce off me. "I don't need to win against the board. I just need to win against you." She blinked. Just for a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, a crack in her armor. Fear, maybe, or the realization that she had underestimated me. When the elevator finally moved again, I knew the war had reached a new stage. This wasn't just about money. This was about power. And I was about to strip it from her, piece by piece. I started digging. Every HOA has skeletons, and Karen had plenty. I found them in the meeting minutes, in the financial reports, in the whispers of neighbors who had suffered under her tyranny but were too afraid to speak up. She'd been siphoning funds, disguising personal expenses as maintenance costs. She'd pushed contracts to her cousin's construction company, overcharging residents for shoddy work.
I compiled everything, every dirty detail, until I had a dossier thick enough to crush her little empire. But I didn't reveal it. Not yet. Revenge is sweeter when it's slow, when it seeps into the cracks and spreads like poison. Instead, I began with small acts, quiet defiance that spread like wildfire. I used the elevator without paying, and others followed. First one, then two, then dozens. Karen chased us with her clipboard, shouting about fines, waving her rules, but the tide had turned. The sheep had grown teeth. And then I unleashed the truth. At the next HOA meeting, with every resident crammed into the community room, I stood up and read out my findings. Line by line, I exposed her fraud. Gasps filled the air. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "You want us to pay for every elevator ride," I said, my voice ringing out like a hammer striking steel. "But you've been stealing from us for years. You call it policy. I call it theft." The room erupted. People who had been silent for months shouted, demanded answers, demanded her resignation. Karen tried to regain control, but it was too late. The power had shifted. That night, as I rode the elevator up to my floor, free and unchallenged, I felt a satisfaction deeper than words. But the war wasn't over. Karen was cornered, humiliated, but not defeated. And cornered animals are always the most dangerous. I knew she'd come for me. I knew she'd try to destroy me the way she had tried to destroy others. But what she didn't understand was that I had only shown her the tip of the iceberg. The real revenge had only just begun. The moment the dossier left my hands, it felt lighter, like a weight that had finally found its place on the floor. The room had been loud, a chaotic thing of shouts and vindication, and Karen's face had been the eye of that storm, stunned, then petulant, then furious. She tried to pivot, to smear, to gaslight, fabricated evidence, personal vendetta, false accusations. But the words came out thin and brittle. People who had heretofore knuckled under and swallowed her barbed little rules now asked for receipts, for phone records, for names. Faces I'd seen hunched over dinner tables, defeated, lifted like curtains. The air tasted different that night. It felt like fresh paint drying on a house once rotten at the studs. She fought back in ways no one had expected. The day after the meeting, she filed for an injunction to block the board from accepting my evidence, threatening lawsuits that smelled of lawyers' hourly rates and the desperate tang of someone trying to buy silence with legalese. She posted a glossy letter to every resident, accusing me of harassment and slander. She called the police on me once, then twice, claiming I was trespassing on HOA property when I walked through the lobby to my own unit. It was theater, an exhausted, febrile theater, and in public it sometimes produced a ripple of sympathy for her, the restive queen of small grievances. I learned something important then. Humiliation doesn't always shrink someone. Sometimes it steels them. Sometimes it makes them sharp and dangerous, like a blade honed on their own failures. So I had to be smart. I wasn't interested in shaming for its own sake. I wanted the rot removed, the accounts straightened, the money returned, the dignity of the people restored. I wanted to end the pensions of petty tyrants. I wanted our elevator to be an elevator, unfettered by tolls and clipboards and the smell of cheap perfume. I wanted the woman who thought power could be worn like a brooch to wake up and find herself alone.
I began with allies. The elderly couple on the fourth floor, Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, had been my first sign of change. At the meeting, Mrs. Alvarez gripped my hand and whispered, "We were so afraid." The single mother with the strollers, Tasha, whose laughter had been brittle from the years of juggling, stood up and told the board how Karen had fined her for excessive elevator use while Tasha paced between job interviews and pediatrician appointments. A mail carrier, who'd never been one for confrontation, brought a ledger of maintenance calls Karen had ignored until a problem became an emergency. Each small story was a stitch. Together, they sewed a new fabric. We collected more documents, quietly, legally, bank statements that showed payments to Karen's cousin, invoices with markups that made the numbers uglier than any fiction, emails where the so-called community projects had clearly been opportunities for private enrichment. We gave copies to a lawyer who specialized in nonprofit mismanagement. She had the eyes of someone who'd seen this film before. You did well, but people like her don't go quietly. You prepare for nastiness.
So we prepared, we recorded, we filed, we kept everything above board because the moral high ground collapses fast if you step off the tightrope. Karen retaliated in predictable ways. Anonymous complaints about my aggressive behavior, attempts to block my access to the community room, calls to the media claiming persecution. There were late-night threats scribbled on my windshield. Someone left a threatening voicemail on my work phone. It stung, but it also taught me who I could trust. Those who would help did so without fanfare. Those who were cowed slunk away like shadows at noon. Then a small human thing happened that changed the tenor of the entire struggle. A video. It was nothing cinematic, just a shaky phone recording taken by a teenager who lived on the 6th floor. It showed Karen in the parking lot, handing envelopes stuffed with cash into the passenger seat of her cousin's van, then hugging him like a co-conspirator at a wedding. The kid uploaded it to a neighborhood social feed with a caption that read only, "Watch." The clip rippled through our community like a pebble through water. Ripples make waves when the pond is already upset. When I shared the video at the next emergency meeting, the room fell into a silence I had never heard there before. Karen's face crumpled. She grabbed for her binder, for anything to steady her. People who had been on the fence now had something they could see with their own eyes. People who had rationalized turned away. Her uncle's voice calling her cousin a good man in the background of that clip, tiny, domestic, damning, made the whole thing grotesque in its ordinariness. Legal action followed. The state attorney's office opened a preliminary inquiry. The HOA called an emergency vote to remove Karen from her position. She resigned eventually, but not before attempting a last act of cowardice. She tried to walk away with a box of records, claiming they were personal copies. The neighbor stopped her in the hallway. Tasha, who'd been harassed most of all, grabbed the box, looked Karen square in the eye, and said, "You don't get to take our history with you." The box was returned. The records remained. The elevator tolls vanished within a week along with the line item on our monthly statement. But cleaning a wound doesn't make the scar vanish. The community had been damaged, trust eroded, friendships strained by suspicion, meetings where people still flinched at the word policy. There was also the question of restitution. Where had all the money gone? Why had the repair budget ballooned when the carpet sprout still curled in the lobby? The attorney pushed for an audit, and the audit dug up a nest of small crimes: misappropriated funds, falsified vendor contracts, unauthorized charges. The law took its measured steps, subpoenas, depositions, a quiet morning when Karen's cousin was taken in for questioning. Karen, for all her bluster, was not a career criminal. She was a bureaucrat who turned brittle ambition into theft. She had to answer for her actions, that was justice, but justice came with complications. Some of the people she'd hurt, like the neighbors who'd been fined into poverty by her petty levies, wanted nothing to do with punishment if it meant their names dragged through courtrooms. Others demanded restitution like a river demanding its course be corrected. A talker in the feed went so far as to suggest a community fund where the misappropriated money would be returned to those who'd been most harmed. $50 here, $200 there. Life being what it is, the sums sometimes unbearable and sometimes petty, but still meaningful to those on the receiving end. And then there was me. After the dust settled, multiple residents came to me, humble and surprised, asking me to run for the board. Someone who won't bend, they said. Someone who's not in it for the file folders and the checkbox victories. I resisted at first. Power had always smelled like something to be wary of. I'd seen how it could curl the edges of a person's soul. But I also knew that leaving the door ajar invited another Karen. The victory, I learned, is a thing that must be defended. The community needed governance that was transparent and accessible, not a showpiece for small tyrannies. So I ran. The campaign was quiet, grassroots. Handshakes in the hallway, typed flyers slipped under doors, promises to publish meeting minutes and make bank statements available to residents. No speeches gilded with fury, no hollow populism. People voted. We won. I took a seat at a table that felt different now, less a stage and more a workshop. The first thing I did was publish the minutes of the last 5 years, line by line, every funding decision annotated and linked to receipts. I established an independent oversight committee that included people who had never considered themselves political actors, Mr. Alvarez, Tasha, the mail carrier, and a retired CPA who lived on the top floor.
We started to heal in small, practical ways. Elevator maintenance moved from a slush fund to a transparent contract with third-party oversight. A neighborhood assistance fund was created to help residents who couldn't afford sudden repairs or medical bills. We held potlucks where Karen's absence felt like a space open for something new. No one used her name much, and when they did, it was with a kind of tired resolve rather than venom. People laughed again, and some of the laughter had a softness to it, a relief that comes from shared trouble survived. Karen's story didn't end with jail time or scornful headlines. There were fines, restitution orders, and a civil suit that dragged for months like low tide. She moved out of the complex eventually to a smaller place where her purchasing of power was limited to a single mailbox. The last I saw of her, she stood on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, watched by a neighbor who had once been one of her staunchest allies. He said nothing. He only held up a stack of canceled checks and walked away. Karen looked at the papers, and for a moment I thought I saw recognition, then shame, then something like grief. It was a private thing. I felt neither triumph nor gloating. I felt the coldness, a sober satisfaction that a system bent for years had righted itself, however imperfectly. There were costs. I lost some friends along the way, people who loathed any kind of conflict and equated peace with silence. I received anonymous letters and a few obscene messages that felt more like the flailing of someone who'd been exposed. The legal bills we accrued to defend the HOA's right to transparency were not insignificant. The community fund covered some, but we asked for small donations, for transparency, for repair of the social fabric instead of cash-only solutions. It was hard in the way the good work is hard. Slow, tedious, often thankless, but it was work that mattered. Most nights now, when I ride the elevator, it's not to feel a private victory. It's to savor the ordinary. I watch faces, people with groceries, teenagers with headphones, the elderly man who chats about his roses, and feel a warmth that isn't triumphal, but human. The elevator hums, its cables sing a steady, trustworthy song. No coins clatter into a box, no clipboard appears. Children press buttons without being told they must pay.
An old woman on the 7th floor still hugs me sometimes in the stairwell and says, "You saved my knees." And I laugh. It's the kind of gratitude that doesn't insist on being repaid. Sometimes late at night, when the building is quiet and the lights pool like spilled milk in the lobby, I think about Karen. I don't hate her anymore. Hatred is too close to the thing that consumed her. Instead, I feel a complex pity. Pity for someone who had stacked herself with rules so thick that she forgot how to be neighborly. I wonder what happens to people who trade human connection for domination. Do they ever learn? Do they sleep differently? Maybe. Maybe not. There is a small bench in the courtyard now where residents leave plants and little care packages if someone's had a rough week. Last spring, when the city planted a line of cherry trees down the block, we planted a small memorial sapling by that bench. Nothing grand, just a slender trunk with soft new leaves. On the day we planted it, the whole building turned up. We shared sandwiches and stories, embarrassing tales, brave admissions, regrets offered and forgiven. A child kicked a ball and someone laughed, and the sound of it seemed to stitch new threads into whatever had been torn. Revenge, in the way I practiced it, tasted less like violence and more like reclamation. It was the act of taking back what had been loaned to someone else by mistake. The dignity of a neighbor, the right to the tools of living, the simple expectation that a community will not be exploited. I did not want to be a hero. I wanted to be a neighbor who would stand up when standing up was necessary. I wanted, in the end, for the elevator to be a reliable, unremarkable thing. I wanted for the next petty tyrant to find the door locked before she could slip inside. If there is a lesson, it is that power left unchecked will always find a way to harvest itself into oppression. But it is equally true that normal people, when they decide not to be afraid, can do more than thwart a petty ruler. They can remake a little corner of the world into something kinder. On the day I moved to a new unit, nothing dramatic, just a small switch for light and view, I stood one last time in the lobby and watched the elevator doors swing open and close. They moved like a heart, slow, reliable, ordinary. I pressed the button, stepped inside, and rode up. The lights hummed above my head. I listened to the cables, those thin, tireless lifelines that had carried us up and down for years, thinking of all those small lifts in life that go unpaid but mean everything. The doors opened to my new floor. I stepped out and turned back for a moment, looking at the shaft that connected us all. Power, I realized then, is not the clipboard or the coin. It's the decision to be petty or to be generous. It's the choice to build a community or to bend it to your will. We've chosen, messy and imperfectly, to build. The elevator hummed its small song as I closed my door. Outside, somewhere down the hall, a child giggled, and the night kept its ordinary, steady breath.